Chapter 7. Let It Rain. On the Wednesday after Thanksgiving break, the fifth graders arrived at school to find Mr. Jupiter. Gone? Missy gasped. This is a case for Imberly Everclass, declared Imberly. He closed his latest McFarty Boys mystery, pulled out his magnifying glass, and began examining the teacher's desk for clues. Get serious, snorted Stanford. He's probably just late. You get serious, replied Imberly. He's never late. At that moment, the door burst open and Mr. Jupiter bustled in, carrying a cardboard box. Everyone, please take your seats, he called out. The fifth graders sat. Forgive my tardiness, Mr. Jupiter continued as he dropped the box on his desk, but I had a minor crisis at home. My 15-inch telescope, with cast-grain focus and 36-segment primary mirror, the one that I just had installed, came crashing in through my roof this morning. Can you believe it? He shook his head. I had lens bits everywhere, and the eyepiece landed right on top of my collection of rare and ancient books and manuscripts. Luckily, they were unharmed. He patted the box. They should be safe here until the roof can be repaired. The students watched as Mr. Jupiter pushed back the box's flaps and pulled out leather-bound volumes trimmed in gold, medieval illuminated manuscripts, clay tablets covered with writing, and fragile scrolls. Sweeping aside the class copies of Cooking with Pooh Without Making a Piglet of Yourself, Mr. Jupiter carefully arranged his collection in the new place on the shelf. He then wiped his hands on his lederhosen and the pair he had brought during his goat herding seminar in the Alps and turned it to face his class. Those would be like his pants. Do not touch these, he said. In the back row, Ham felt a sudden urge to unroll the scrolls, touch the markings, and run his finger along the exotic spines. Not only are they rare and valuable, continued Mr. Jupiter, but they contain the secret of the ancient world, knowledge that you are not yet old enough to comprehend. In the back row, Ham longed to peek in between the fine leather covers. So, fifth graders, concluded Mr. Jupiter with a smile, hands off. In the back row, Ham shivered with excitement. He couldn't wait to get his hands on the collection. His chance came at lunchtime. Cook had already heaped Ham's tray with 7-layer cranberry loaf. She was still getting rid of last week's leftovers when he slapped his forehead. I left my lunch pass in my desk, he cried. Cook snatched back her food. Go get it, she said, but be quick. Cranberry loaf is a dish that's best served hot. Ham hurried back to the now empty classroom. He rummaged around in his desk and pulled out his pass and Mr. Jupiter's collection. For the first time in his life, literature pushed lunch right out of Ham's head. He moved toward the shelf. Glancing around, he pulled down a volume. It was thick and heavy and centuries old. The cover smelled of dust and secrets. Ham peered at the title, written in faded gold leaf. The Babylonian Book of Babel, an ancient primer. He opened it with a creak. On page 4, Ham found a chart labeled Pyramids and Ziggurats Made Easy. On page 76, he found instructions titled How to Weed Your Hanging Gardens. And on page 1003, he found an illuminating engraving of the thunderstorm, completed with black clouds, flashing lightning, floods, and hail. Beneath the engraving were the words, Yahweh Og Nair Nair. I wonder what that's about, he thought. He muttered the words out loud to himself. Yahweh Og Nair Nair. A wispy gray rain cloud appeared above his head. Drip, drop. The cloud squeezed out a thimbleful of water, and then, poof, it dissipated. No way, gasped Ham, wiping the trickle of rainwater from his cheek. And then he said the words again. Yahweh Og Nair Nair. This time a slightly bigger, slightly darker cloud appeared. Ham pointed to the Venus flytrap setting on the windowsill. The cloud obeyed. It glided across the room, stopped above the plant, and dribble, dribble, pitter, plop, produced a light drizzle. The Venus flytrap snapped angrily at the raindrops. Poof! The second cloud dissipated just like the first. Ham let the truth sink in, and then, "I've got the power," he sang at the top of his voice. He danced around and he punched the air. "The power, the power! Woo, woo, woo!" In the cage, the Burmese speckled guinea pig sang back in perfect harmony. "Eek, eek, eek!" "I can't wait to show Humphrey," exclaimed Ham. Without bothering to read the rest of the page, he slid the book back onto the shelf and bolted for the lunchroom. But in the doorway, he skittered to a stop. Mrs. Buns was on a rampage. "Who put their leftover soup in the recycling bin?" The lunchroom monitor bellowed into her bullhorn. Plucking out the offending bowl, she held it high for everyone to see and then poured it into the bucket of slop at her feet. "Who's responsible for this irresponsibility?" Cowering, the students stared nervously down at their corn chips and carrot sticks, and Ham whispered, "Yawa og Nair Nair." The cloud materialized, a bit bigger and a bit darker than before. Feeling powerful, Ham pointed to the lunchroom monitor. The cloud stormed across the lunchroom. It snatched the hairnet from Mrs. Bunn's head. It ripped the apron from her ample hips. It grabbed the bullhorn from her tight fist and sent it skittering. Then, splash! It drenched her with a cloudburst, and poof! It was gone. A stunned silence fell over the lunchroom. Then, "I always knew that Mrs. Buns was all wet," cried Bruce. The place exploded in loud, roaring laughter that all echoed in the hallway, all the way to the teacher's lounge. "Did you hear that?" asked Miss Glutiel, her cupcake-laden forks stopping in midair. "It sounded like a riot." Mrs. Chin nodded in agreement. "Perhaps one of us should go and see what's happening," she suggested. "Before someone makes a mess," agreed Mr. Squill. "Or gets hurt," said Nurse Betadine. "Or earns a detention," said Mrs. Struggles. The teachers looked at one another for a moment. Then Mrs. Glutiel held up her plate. "Cake, anyone?" In the lunchroom, and now dripping wet, Mrs. Buns whirled on the students. "Who did that?" No one answered. Miss Buns' eyes became slits. "You haven't heard the last of this," she warned. "I'll ferret out the culprit. I'll find you. And when I do, it'll be 5 minutes on the wall. 5 minutes on the wall." It was Mrs. Buns' favorite punishment, a unique form of torture involving a public apology and 5 long, humiliating minutes against the cold tiles of the lunchroom wall. On the wall! Those 3 little words caused everyone, 1st through 5th grade alike, to freeze. "Perhaps," decided Ham with a shudder, "I should keep my new power a secret." That afternoon, Mr. Jupiter said, "I understand something very unusual took place in the lunchroom today." He studied each of his students' faces. "Does anyone know what happened?" "I believe it was one of the simple life mysteries," said Lil, as she waxed poetic. "Ah, sweet mystery of life, at last I found thee. Ah, at last I know the secret of it all." "No mystery should go unexplained," said Emberly. "Artie McFarty says—" Stanford interrupted with a snort. "Get serious. There's a logical and scientific explanation for what happened." Mr. Jupiter looked around the room. "Does anyone have an explanation?" The class fell silent. In the back row, Ham plastered an innocent look on his face. "One last question," said Mr. Jupiter. "Who watered the Venus flytrap? It's been spitting and sputtering since lunchtime." The classroom stayed silent. "Anyone?" persisted Mr. Jupiter. "Patooey!" coughed the flytrap. Disappointed, Mr. Jupiter shook his head. "If no one will answer my question, then I guess we'll just have to move on." Picking up a stack of papers, he began handing them out. "I hope you all did your zoology reading last night, because we're going to have a pop quiz." Ham leaned forward. "Zoology reading?" he whispered to Victoria. "I didn't even know we had a zoology book." "Too bad for you," she replied, with a flip of her hair. Remembers, Victoria is the one who is kind of snooty and she thinks she's better than everybody else. Ham gulped and read the first question. Bactrian camels have 2 humps. What is a 1-hump camel called? Ham had no idea. Guessing, he wrote Humphrey. He moved on to the second question. What do ducks do in the fall when food is scarce? Ham guessed again. Go to the store and say, put it on my bill. Like his duck bill? He read the third question. What animal has 3 heads and smells bad? Ham wrote, Victoria. But he knew that wasn't right. He was pretty sure his first 2 answers weren't right either. But for the next 97 questions, he didn't have a clue. He did, however, have the power. Yawa Og Nayer Nayer. A cloud materialized, the biggest and darkest of them all. Ham made a swirling motion with his hand. Instantly, a cool mist of rain swirled around the 5th graders, tickling their faces, freckling their test papers. Ashley Z peeled off his shoes and socks and splashed in the little puddles that began to form on the floor, while Lil and the Burmese speckled guinea pigs burst into squeaky rendition of Singin' in the Rain. So much for zoology, smirked Ham, feeling powerful. He signals for the cloud to stop. Instead, it turned darker. Thunder rumbled, lightning flashed. The gentle mist turned into stinging, splashing rain. Take cover! Shouted Mr. Jupiter, braving the storm. He raced back and forth between the bookshelf containing his collection of nearby Byzantine funeral chest. With the last manuscript was saved, he dove in on top of the pile. The 5th graders ducked beneath their desk. What's happening? Cried Calvin as he fumbled in his desk for a pencil to chew on. Mr. Jupiter, begged Ernest, please make it stop. From inside the chest, Mr. Jupiter called out, I can't control the weather. Even though he couldn't see Mr. Jupiter's eyes, Ham swore that he could feel them boring into him. Please, cloud, stop now, Ham begged. But the cloud turned darker. It whirled, it churned, it snatched the test papers off the desk. It spun them around and around. Hey, Stanford shouted to the cloud. No copying. He tried to grab his test back. Zap! The cloud shot him a warning of flash lightning. Yow! Stanford cried. Ham was whimpering now. Please stop, Cloud. Please, pretty please, with hot fudge and tuna on top. Instead it hailed. Balls of ice pinged and popped, bounced across the classroom. They put a dent in the suit of armor. They dimpled the Zula war shield and bruised Rachel's head. Ouchie! She cried. Remember, Rachel's the one that doesn't talk. She just goes. Pfft, pfft. Beneath his desk, Ham felt powerless. He burst into tears. It's my fault. I touched Mr. Jupiter's rare books, he wailed at the top of his voice. I read the ancient words. I learned how to turn the cloud on, but I didn't learn how to turn it off. Mr. Jupiter poked his head out of the chest. Thank you for your honesty, Ham, he shouted over the hail. Honesty, schmonesty, hollered Missy. Who will stop the rain? If I recall correctly, cried Mr. Jupiter, page 24 of the Babylonian Book of Babel clearly states that to reverse the curse, one must reverse the verse. A golf ball-sized piece of hail smacked him on the head. But I may be mistaken. Huh? Asked Ham. Reverse the verse? As the ice balls bounced around him, Ham pondered. Mr. Jupiter's words, reverse the verse, reverse the curse. And then it struck him. Yawa Og Nayer Nayer backwards was, I'm going to have you stop and think about YAWAOGNIAR. What is that backwards? Rain, rain, go away, shouted Ham. And at last the hail stopped. The cloud disappeared. The test papers floated back down to the desktop. Thank you, Ham, said Mr. Jupiter, climbing out of the chest, squeezing water from his bow tie. Is everyone all right? The soggy student sputtered and nodded just as the final bell rang. We'll finish our quizzes tomorrow, said Mr. Jupiter, once they've dried off. Nodding again, the students sloshed toward the door. Hold on a minute, Ham, said Mr. Jupiter. Where do you think you're going? Home, replied Ham. Mr. Jupiter shook his head. You'll be going to the broom closet, he said. Huh? Asked Ham. That's where the mop and bucket are kept, added Mr. Jupiter. Oh, said Ham. I get it. For the next hour, Ham mopped and wrung and sponged. He toweled off the guinea pigs. He squeezed out the Venus flytrap. He polished the suit of armor until there wasn't a water spot on it. He steered well clear of the shelf where Mr. Jupiter's collection of rare and ancient books and manuscripts once again sat. I'm keeping my hands off, he told himself. The moral of this chapter is a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Think about what that might mean. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Bye.